enchanted palace, but one willingly returns to the inspection of things which are rare, singular, and costly. Beauty turned her steps towards a great saloon, which she had only seen once before. This room had 4 windows in it on each side. 2 only were open, and admitted a glimmering light. Beauty wished for more light, but in lieu of obtaining any by opening another window, she found it only looked into some enclosed space, which, although large, was obscure, and her eyes could distinguish nothing but a distant gleam, which appeared to reach them through the medium of a very thick crape. Whilst pondering for what purpose this place could have been designed, she was suddenly dazzled by a brilliant illumination. The curtain rose and discovered to Beauty a theatre, exceedingly well lighted. On the benches and in the boxes she beheld all that was most handsome and well made of either sex. A sweet symphony, which instantly commenced, terminated only to permit other actors than monkey and parrot performers to represent a very fine tragedy, which was followed by a little piece, quite equal in its own style to that which had preceded it. Beauty was fond of plays. It was the only pleasure she had regretted when she left the city. Desiring to ascertain what sort of material the hangings of the box next to her were made of, she found herself prevented doing so by a glass which separated them, and thereby discovered that what she had seen were not the actual objects, but a reflection of them by means of this crystal mirror, which thus conveyed to her sight all that was passing on the stage of the finest city in the world. It is a master stroke in optics to be able to reflect from such a distance. She remained in her box some time after the play was over, in order to see the fine company go out. The darkness that gradually ensued compelled her to think of other matters. Satisfied with this discovery, of which she promised to avail herself often, she descended into the gardens. Prodigies were becoming familiar to her. She rejoiced to find they were all performed for her advantage and amusement. After supper, the Beast came, as usual, to ask her what she had been doing during the day. Beauty gave him an exact account of all her amusements, and told him she had been to the play. "Do you like it?" inquired the dull creature. "Wish for whatever you please, you shall have it. You are very handsome." Beauty smiled to herself at the coarse manner in which he paid her compliments. But what she did not smile at was the usual question, and the words, "Will you marry me?" put an end to her good humor. She had only to answer, "No." But, nevertheless, his docility during this last interview did not reassure her. Beauty was alarmed at it. "What is to be the end of all this?" she said to herself. "The question he puts to me every time, will I marry him, proves that he persists in loving me, his bounty to me confirms it. But though he does not insist on my compliance, nor show any signs of resentment at my refusal, who will be answerable to me that he do not eventually lose his patience, and that my death will not be the consequence?" These reflections rendered her so thoughtful that it was almost daylight before she went to bed. The unknown, who but awaited that moment to appear, reproached her tenderly for her delay. He found her melancholy, lost in thought, and inquired what could have displeased her in such a place. She answered that nothing displeased her, except the monster whom she saw every evening. She should have become accustomed to him, but he was in love with her, and this love made her apprehensive of some violence. "By the foolish compliments he pays me," said Beauty to her lover, "I find he desires to marry me. Would you advise me to consent? Alas! Were he as charming as he is frightful, you have rendered my heart inaccessible to him and to all others. And I do not blush to own that I can love no one but you." So sweet a confession could but flatter the unknown, yet he replied to her only by saying, "Love him who loves you. Do not be misled by appearances, and release me from prison." These words, continually repeated without any explanation, caused Beauty infinite distress. "What would you that I should do?" said she to him. "I would restore you to liberty at any price, but my desire is vain while you abstain from furnishing me with the means to put it in practice." The unknown made her some answer, but of so confused a nature that she could not comprehend it. 1,000 extravagant fancies passed before her eyes. She saw the monster on a throne all blazing with jewels. He called to her and invited her to sit beside him. A moment afterwards, the unknown compelled him precipitately to descend, and seated himself in his place. The Beast regaining the advantage, the unknown disappeared in his turn. He spoke to her from behind a black veil, which changed his voice, and rendered it horrible. All her sleep passed in this manner, and yet, notwithstanding the agitation it caused her, she felt it was too soon over, as her awakening deprived her of the sight of the object of her affections. After she had finished dressing, various sorts of work, books, and animals occupied her attention until the hour when the play began. She arrived just in time, but she was not at the same theatre. It was the opera, and the performance commenced as soon as she was seated. The spectacle was magnificent, and the spectators were not less so. The mirrors represented to her distinctly the most minute details of the dresses even of the people in the pit. Delighted to behold human forms and faces, many of which she recognized as those of persons she knew, it would have been a still greater pleasure to her could she have spoken to them, so that they could have heard her. More gratified with this day's entertainment than with that of the preceding, the rest of it passed in the same way that each had done since she had been in that palace. The beast came in the evening, and after his visit she retired, as usual. The night resembled former nights, that is, it was passed in agreeable dreams. When she awoke, she found the same number of domestics to wait upon her. But after dinner her occupations were different. The day before, on opening another of the windows, she had found herself at the opera. To diversify her amusements, she now opened a third window, which displayed to her all the pleasures of the fair of Saint Germain, much more brilliant then than it is at the present day. But as the hour had not quite arrived when the best company resorted to it, she had leisure to observe and examine everything. She saw the rarest curiosities, the most extraordinary productions of nature and works of art. The minutest trifles were visible to her. The puppet show was not unworthy of her attention, whilst waiting for more refined entertainments. The comic opera was in its splendor. Beauty was very much delighted. At the termination of the performances, she saw all the well-dressed people visiting the tradesmen's shops. She recognized amongst the crowd several professional gamesters, who flocked to this place as their workshop. She observed persons who, having lost their money by the cleverness of those they played with, went out with less joyous countenances than they exhibited as they entered. The prudent gamblers, who did not stake their whole fortunes on the hazard of a card, and who played to profit by their skill, could not conceal from beauty their sleight of hand. She longed to warn the victims of the tricks they were plundered by. But at a distance from them of more than 1,000 leagues it was not in her power to do so. She heard and saw everything distinctly, without its being possible for her to make herself heard or seen by others. The reflections and echoes which conveyed to her all these sights and sounds had no returning power. Placed above the air and wind, everything came to her like a thought. The consideration of this fact deterred her from making vain attempts. It was past midnight before she thought it was time to retire. The need of some refreshment might have hinted to her the lateness of the hour. But she had found in her box liqueurs and baskets filled with everything requisite for a collation. Her supper was light and of short duration, she was in a hurry to go to bed. The beast observed her impatience, and came merely to say good night, that she might have more time to sleep and the unknown liberty to reappear. The following days resembled each other. She found in her windows an inexhaustible source of fresh entertainments. The first of the other three afforded her the pleasure of witnessing Italian comedy. The second, a sight of the Tuileries, the resort of all the most distinguished and handsome of both sexes. The last window was very far from being the least agreeable. It enabled her to see everything of consequence that was going on in the world. The scene was amusing and interesting in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it was the reception of a grand embassy, at others the marriage of some illustrious personages, and occasionally some exciting revolutions. She was at this window during the last revolt of the Janissaries, and witnessed the whole of it to the very end. At all times she was certain to find something here to entertain her. The weariness she had felt at first in listening to the beast had entirely departed. Her eyes had become accustomed to his ugliness. She was prepared for his foolish questions, and if their conversations had lasted longer, perchance she would have not been displeased. But 4 or 5 sentences, always the same, uttered in a coarse manner, and productive only of a yes or no, were not much to her taste. As the slightest desires of beauty appeared to be anticipated, she bestowed more care upon her toilet, although certain that no one could see her. But she owed this attention to herself, and it was a pleasure to her to dress herself in the habits of all the various nations on the face of the earth. She could do this the more easily, as her wardrobe furnished her with everything she chose, and presented her every day with some novelty. Contemplating her mirror in these various dresses, it revealed to her that she was to be admired in all lands, and her attendant animals, each according to their talent, repeated to her unceasingly the same fact: the monkeys by their actions, the parrots by their language, and the other birds by their songs. So delightful a life ought to have perfectly contented her, but we weary of everything. The greatest happiness fades when it is continual, derived always from the same source, and we find ourselves exempted from fear and from hope. Beauty had experienced this. The remembrance of her family arose to trouble her in the midst of her prosperity. Her happiness could not be perfect as long as she was denied the pleasure of informing her relations of it. As she had become more familiar with the beast, either from the habit of seeing him or from the gentleness which she had discovered in his nature, she thought she might venture to ask him a question. She did not take this liberty, however, until she had obtained from him a promise that he would not be angry. The question she put to him was, were they the only two persons in that castle? Yes, I protest to you, replied the beast, in a rather excited tone, and I assure you that you and I, the monkeys, and the other animals, are the only breathing creatures in this place. The beast said no more, and departed more abruptly than usual. Beauty had asked this question only with a view of ascertaining whether her lover was not confined in the palace. She would have wished to see and speak with him. It was a happiness she would have purchased at the price of her own liberty and of all the pleasures by which she was surrounded. That charming youth existing only in her imagination, she now looked upon this palace as a prison which would be one day her tomb. These melancholy ideas crowded also upon her mind at night. She dreamed she was on the banks of a great canal. She was weeping, when her dear unknown, alarmed at her sad state, said to her, pressing her hand tenderly between his own, "What is the matter, my beloved Beauty? Who can have offended you, and what can possibly have disturbed your tranquility? By the love I bear you, I conjure you to explain the cause of your distress. Nothing shall be refused to you. You are sole sovereign here, everything is at your command. Whence arises the sorrow that overpowers you? Is it the sight of the beast that afflicts you? You must be relieved from it." At these words Beauty imagined she saw the unknown draw a dagger, and prepare to plunge it in the throat of the monster, who made no attempt to defend himself, but, on the contrary, offered his neck to the blow with a submission and a calmness which caused the beautiful dreamer to fear the unknown would accomplish his purpose before she could endeavor to prevent him, notwithstanding she had instantly risen to protect the beast. The instant she saw her efforts likely to be anticipated, she exclaimed, with all her might, "Hold, barbarian! Harm not my benefactor, or else kill me." The unknown, who continued striking at the beast, notwithstanding the shrieks of Beauty, said to her, angrily, "You love me, then, no longer, since you take the part of this monster, who is an obstacle to my happiness." "You are ungrateful," she replied, still struggling with him. "I love you more than my life, and I would lose it sooner than cease to love you. You are all the world to me, and I would not do you the injustice to compare you with any other treasure it possesses. I would, without a sigh, abandon all it could offer me, to follow you into the wildest desert. But this tender affection does not stifle my gratitude. I owe everything to the beast. He anticipates all my wishes, it is to him I am indebted for the joy of knowing you, and I would die sooner than endure seeing you do him the slightest injury." After several similar struggles the objects vanished, and Beauty fancied she saw the lady who had appeared to her some nights before, and who said to her, "Courage, Beauty, be a model of female generosity, show thyself to be as wise as thou art charming, do not hesitate to sacrifice thy inclination to thy duty. Thou takest the true path to happiness. Thou wilt be blessed, provided thou art not misled by deceitful appearances." When Beauty awoke she pondered on this mysterious vision, but it still remained an enigma to her. Her desire to see her father superseded, during the day, the anxiety caused by these dreams of the monster and the unknown. Thus, neither tranquil at night nor contented by day, although surrounded by the greatest luxuries, the only distraction she could find was in the theatre. She went to the Italians, but after the first scene she quitted the performance for the opera, which she left almost as quickly. Her melancholy followed her everywhere. She frequently opened each of the 6 windows as many times without finding 1 minute's respite from her cares. Days and nights of equal and unceasing agitation began seriously to affect her appearance and her health. She took great pains to conceal from the beast the sorrow which preyed upon her. And the monster, who had frequently surprised her with the tears in her eyes, upon hearing her say that she was only suffering from a headache, pressed his inquiries no further. One evening, however, her sobs having betrayed her, and feeling it impossible longer to dissimulate, she acknowledged to the beast, who begged to know what had caused her afflictions, that she was yearning to see her family. At this declaration the beast sank down without power to sustain himself, and heaving a deep sigh, or rather uttering a howl that might have frightened anyone to death, he replied, "How, Beauty? Would you, then, abandon an unfortunate beast? Could I have imagined you possessed so little gratitude? What have I left undone to make you happy? Should not the attentions I have paid you preserve me from your hatred? Unjust as you are, you prefer the house of your father and the jealousy of your sisters to my palace and my affections. You would rather tend the flocks with them than enjoy with me all the pleasures of existence. It is not love for your family, but antipathy to me, that makes you anxious to depart. No, beast, replied Beauty, timidly and soothingly, I do not hate you, and should regret to lose the hope of seeing you again, but I cannot overcome the desire I feel to embrace my relations. Permit me to go away for 2 months, and I promise you that I will return with pleasure to pass the rest of my days with you, and never ask you another favor. While she spoke, the beast stretched on the ground, his head thrown back, only evinced that he still breathed by his sorrowful sighs. He answered her in these words, I can refuse you nothing. But it will perhaps cost me my life. No matter. In the cabinet nearest to your apartment you will find 4 chests. Fill them with anything you like for yourself or for your family. If you break your word you will repent it, and regret the death of your poor beast when it will be too late. Return at the end of 2 months, and you will still see me alive. For your journey back to me you will need no equipage. Merely take leave of your family the previous night before you retire to rest, and when you are in bed turn your ring, the stone inside your hand, and say, with a firm voice, I desire to return to my palace, and behold my beast again. Good night, fear nothing, sleep in peace. You will see your father early tomorrow morning. Adieu, Beauty. As soon as she was alone she hastened to fill the chests with all the treasures and beautiful things imaginable. They only appeared to be full when she was tired of putting things into them. After these preparations, she went to bed. The thoughts of seeing her family so soon kept her awake great part of the night, and sleep only stole upon her towards the hour when she should have been stirring. She saw in her dreams her amiable unknown, but not as formerly. Stretched upon a bed of turf, he appeared a prey to the keenest sorrow. Beauty, touched at seeing him in such a state, flattered herself she could alleviate his profound affliction by requesting to know the cause of it. But her lover, casting on her a look full of despair, said, Can you ask me such a question, inhuman girl? Are you not aware that your departure dooms me to death? Abandon not yourself to sorrow, dear unknown, replied she, my absence will be brief. I wish but to undeceive my family respecting the cruel fate they imagine has befallen me. I return immediately afterwards to this palace. I shall leave you no more. Ah, could I abandon a residence in which I so delight? Besides, I have pledged my word to the beast, that I will return. I cannot fail to keep it, and why must this journey separate us? Be my escort. I will defer my departure another day, in order to obtain the beast's permission. I am sure he will not refuse me. Agree to my proposal, and we shall not part. We will return together, my family will be delighted to see you, and I will answer for their showing you all the attention you deserve. I cannot accede to your wishes, replied the unknown, unless you determine never to return hither. It is the only means of enabling me to quit this spot. How will you decide? The inhabitants of this palace have no power to compel you to return. Nothing can happen to you beyond the knowledge that you have grieved the beast. You do not consider, rejoined Beauty, quickly, that he assured me he should die if I broke my word to him. What matters it to you? Retorted the lover, is it to be counted a misfortune that your happiness should cost only the life of a monster? Of what use is he to the world? Will anyone be a loser by the destruction of a being who appears upon earth only to be the horror of all nature? Ha! Exclaimed Beauty, almost angrily, know that I would lay down my life to save his, and that this monster, who is only one in form, has a heart so humane, that he should not be persecuted for a deformity which he refrains from rendering more hideous by his actions. I will not repay his kindness with such black ingratitude. The unknown, interrupting her, inquired what she would do if the monster endeavored to kill him. And, if it were decreed that one of them must slay the other, to which would she afford assistance? I love you only, she replied, but extreme as is my affection for you, it cannot weaken my gratitude to the beast, and if I found myself placed in so fatal a position, I would escape the misery which the result of such a combat would inflict on me, by dying by my own hand. But why indulge in such dreadful suppositions? However chimerical, the idea freezes my blood. Let us change the conversation. She set him the example, by saying all that an affectionate girl could say, most flattering to her lover. She was not restrained by the rigid customs of society, and slumber left her free to act naturally. She acknowledged to him her love with a frankness which she would have shrunk from when in full possession of her reason. Her sleep was of long duration, and when she awoke she feared the beast had failed in his promise to her. She was in this uncertainty when she heard the sound of a human voice which she recognized. Undrawing her curtains precipitately, what was her surprise when she found herself in a strange apartment, the furniture of which was not near so superb as that in the palace of the beast. This prodigy induced her to rise hastily, and open the door of her chamber. The next room was equally strange to her, but what astonished her still more, was to find in it the 4 chests she had filled the previous evening. The transport of herself and her treasures was a proof of the power and bounty of the beast. But where was she? She could not imagine, when at length she heard the voice of her father, and rushing out, she flung her arms round his neck. Her appearance astounded her brothers and sisters. They stared at her as at one come from the other world. All her family embraced her with the greatest demonstrations of delight. But her sisters, in their hearts, were vexed at beholding her. The jealousy was not extinguished. After many caresses on both sides, the good man desired to speak with her privately, to learn from her own lips all the circumstances of so extraordinary a journey, and to inform her of the state of his own fortune, of which he had set apart a large share for herself. He told her that on the evening of the same day that he had left the palace of the beast, he had reached his own house without the least fatigue. That on the road he had cogitated how he could best manage to conceal his trunks from the sight of his children, and wished that they could be carried without their knowledge into a little cabinet adjoining his bed-chamber, of which he alone had the key, that he had looked upon this as an impossibility. But that, on dismounting at his door, he found the horse on which his trunks had been placed had run away, and therefore saw himself suddenly spared the trouble of hiding his treasures. I assure thee, said the old man to his daughter, that the loss of these riches did not distress me. I had not possessed them long enough to regret them greatly. But the adventure appeared to me a gloomy prognostic of my fate. I did not hesitate to believe that the perfidious beast would act in the same manner by thee. I feared that the favors he conferred upon thee would not be more durable. This idea caused me great anxiety. To conceal it, I feigned to be in need of rest, it was only to abandon myself without restraint to my grief. I looked upon thy destruction as certain, but my sorrow was soon dissipated. The sight of the trunks I thought I had lost renewed my hopes of thy happiness. I found them placed in my little cabinet, precisely where I had wished them to be. The keys of them, which I had forgotten and left behind me on the table in the saloon wherein we had passed the night, were in the locks. This circumstance, which afforded me a new proof of the kindness of the beast, and his constant attention, overwhelmed me with joy. It was then that, no longer doubting the advantageous result of thy adventure, I reproached myself for entertaining such unjust suspicions of the honor of that generous monster, and craved his pardon 100 times for the abuse which, in my distress, I had mentally lavished upon him. Without informing my children of the extent of my wealth, I contented myself with distributing amongst them the presents thou hadst sent them, and showing them some jewels of moderate value. I afterwards pretended to have sold them, and have employed the money in various ways for the improvement of our income. I have bought this house, I have slaves, who relieve us from the labors to which necessity had subjected us. My children lead an easy life, that is all I care for. Ostentation and luxury drew upon me, in other days, the hatred of the envious. I should incur it again did I live in the style of a very wealthy man. Many offers have been made to thy sisters, Beauty, I am about to marry them off immediately, and thy fortunate arrival decides me. Having given to them such portions of the wealth thou hast brought to me, as thou shalt think fit, and relieved of all care for their establishment, we will live, my daughter, with thy brothers, whom thy presents were not able to console for thy loss, or, if thou prefer it, we too will live together independently of them. Beauty, affected by the kindness of her father, and the assurance he gave her of the love of her brothers, thanked him tenderly for all his offers, and thought it would be wrong to conceal from him the fact that she had not come to stay with him. The good man, distressed to learn that he should not have the support of his child in his declining years, did not, however, attempt to dissuade her from the fulfillment of a duty which he acknowledged indispensable. Beauty, in her turn, related to him all that had happened to her since they parted. She described to him the pleasant life she led. The good man, enraptured at the charming account of his daughter's adventures, heaped blessings on the head of the beast. His delight was much greater still when Beauty, opening the chests, displayed to him the immense treasures they contained, and satisfied him that he was at liberty to dispose of those which he had brought himself, in favor of his daughters, as he would possess, in these last proofs of the beast's generosity, ample means to live merrily with his sons. Discovering in this monster too noble a mind to be lodged in so hideous a body, he deemed it his duty to advise his daughter to marry him, notwithstanding his ugliness. He employed even the strongest arguments to induce her to take that step. "Thou shouldst not take counsel from thine eyes alone," said he to her. "Thou hast been unceasingly exhorted to let thyself be guided by gratitude. By following her inspirations thou art assured thou wilt be happy. It is true these warnings are only given thee in dreams. But these dreams are too significant and too frequent to be attributed to chance. They promise thee great advantages, enough to conquer thy repugnance. Therefore, the next time that the beast asks thee if thou wilt marry him, I advise thee not to refuse him. Thou hast admitted to me that he loves thee tenderly, take the proper means to make thy union with him indissoluble. It is much better to have an amiable husband than one whose only recommendation is a handsome person. How many girls are compelled to marry rich brutes, much more brutish than the beast, who is only one in form, and not in his feelings or his actions." Beauty admitted the reason of all these arguments, but to resolve to marry a monster so horrible in person and who seemed as stupid as he was gigantic, appeared to her an impossibility. "How can I determine," replied she to her father, "to take a husband with whom I can have no sympathy, and whose hideousness is not compensated for by the charms of his conversation? No other object to distract my attention, and relieve that wearisome companionship. Not to have the pleasure of being sometimes absent from him. To hear nothing beyond 5 or 6 questions respecting my health or my appetite, followed by a 'good night, beauty,' a chorus which my parrots know by heart, and repeat 100 times a day. It is not in my power to endure such a union, and I would rather perish at once than be dying every day of fright, sorrow, disgust, and weariness. There is nothing to plead in his favor, except the consideration he evinces in paying me very short visits, and presenting himself before me but once in 24 hours. Is that enough to inspire one with affection?" The father admitted that his daughter had reason on her side, but observing so much civility in the beast, he could not believe him to be as stupid as she represented him. The order, the abundance, the good taste that was discernible through his palace, were not, according to his thinking, the work of a fool. In fact, he found him worthy of the consideration of his daughter, and Beauty might have felt more inclined to listen to the monster, had not her nocturnal lover's appearance thrown an obstacle in the way. The comparison she drew between these two admirers could not be favorable to the beast. The old man himself was fully aware of the great distinction which must be made between them. Notwithstanding, he tried by all manner of means to overcome her repugnance. He recalled to her the advice of the lady who had warned her not to be prejudiced by appearances, and whose language seemed to imply that this youth would only make her miserable. It is easier to reason with love than to conquer it. Beauty had not the power to yield to the reiterated requests of her father. He left her without having been able to persuade her. Night, already far advanced, invited her to repose, and the daughter, although delighted to see her father once more, was not sorry that he left her at liberty to retire to rest. She was glad to be alone. Her heavy eyelids inspired her with the hope that in slumber she would soon again behold her beloved unknown. She was eager to enjoy this innocent pleasure. A quickened pulsation evinced the joy with which her gentle heart would greet the pleasant vision, but her excited imagination, while representing to her the scenes in which she had usually held sweet converse with that dear unknown, had not sufficient power to conjure up his form to her as she so ardently desired. She awoke several times, but on falling asleep again no cupids fluttered round her couch. In a word, instead of a night full of sweet thoughts and innocent pleasures, which she had counted on passing in the arms of sleep, it was to her one of interminable length and endless anxiety. She had never known any like it in the palace of the beast, and the day, which she at last saw break with a mingled feeling of satisfaction and impatience, came opportunely to relieve her from this weariness. Her father, enriched by the liberality of the beast, had quitted his country house, and in order to facilitate the establishment of his daughters, resided in a very large city, where his new fortune obtained for him new friends, or rather new acquaintances. Amidst the circle who visited him the tidings soon spread that his youngest daughter had returned. Everybody evinced an equal impatience to see her, and were each as much charmed with her intellect as with her beauty. The peaceful days she had passed in her desert palace, the innocent pleasures which a gentle slumber had invariably procured her, the thousand amusements which succeeded, so that dullness could never take possession of her spirit, in brief, all the attentions of the monster had combined to render her still more beautiful and more charming than she was when her father first parted from her. She was the admiration of all who saw her. The suitors to her sisters, without condescending to excuse their infidelity by the slightest pretext, fell in love with her, and attracted by the power of her charms, deserted, without a blush, their former mistresses. Insensible to the marked attentions of a crowd of adorers, she neglected nothing that could discourage them and induce them to return to the previous objects of their affection, but, notwithstanding all her care, she could not escape the jealousy of her sisters. The inconstant lovers, far from concealing their new passion, invented every day some fresh entertainment, with the view of paying their court to her. They entreated her even to bestow the prize in the games which took place in her honor. But Beauty, who could not be blind to the mortification she was causing her sisters, and yet was unwilling to refuse utterly the favor they implored so ardently, and in so flattering a manner, found means to satisfy them all, by declaring that she would, alternately with her sisters, present the prize to the victor. What she selected was a flower, or some equally simple guerdon. She left to her elder sisters the honor of giving, in their turn, jewels, crowns of diamonds, costly weapons, or superb bracelets, presents which her liberal hand supplied them with, but for which she would not take the slightest credit. The treasures lavished on her by the monster left her in want of nothing. She divided between her sisters everything she had brought that was most rare and elegant. Bestowing nothing but trifles herself, and leaving him the pleasure of giving largely, she counted on securing for them the love as well as the gratitude of the youthful combatants. But these lovers sought only to gain her heart, and the simplest gift from her hand was more precious to them than all the treasures that were prodigally heaped upon them by the others. The amusements she partook of amongst her family, though vastly inferior to those she enjoyed in the palace of the Beast, entertained her sufficiently to prevent the time hanging heavily on her hands. At the same time, neither the gratification of seeing her father, whom she tenderly loved, nor the pleasure of being with her brothers, who in 100 ways studied to prove to her the extent of their affection, nor the delight of conversing with her sisters, of whom she was very fond, though they were not so of her, could prevent her regretting her agreeable dreams. Her unknown, greatly to her sorrow, came not, when she slumbered under her father's roof, to address her in the tenderest language, and the court paid to her by those who had been the admirers of her sisters, did not compensate for the loss of that pleasing illusion. Had she even been of a nature to feel flattered by such conquests, she would still have distinguished an immense difference between their attentions, or those of the Beast, and the devotion of her charming unknown. Their assiduities were received by her with the greatest indifference. But Beauty, perceiving that, notwithstanding her coolness, they were obstinately bent on rivaling each other in the task of proving to her the intensity of their passion, thought it her duty to make them clearly understand they were losing their time. The first she endeavored to undeceive was one who had courted her eldest sister. She told him that she had only returned for the purpose of being present at the marriage of her sisters, particularly that of her eldest sister, and that she was about to press her father to settle it immediately. Beauty found that she had to deal with a man who saw no longer any charms in her sister. He sighed alone for her, and coldness, disdain, the threat to depart before the expiration of the 2 months, nothing, in short, could discourage him. Much vexed at having failed in her object, she held a similar conversation with the others, whom she had the mortification to find equally infatuated. To complete her distress, her unjust sisters, who looked upon her as a rival, conceived a hatred to her which they could not dissemble, and whilst Beauty was deploring the too great power of her charms, she had the misery of learning that her new adorers, believing each to be the cause of the other's rejection, were bent, in the maddest way, on fighting it out amongst themselves. All these annoyances induced her to determine upon returning sooner than she had contemplated. Her father and brothers did all they could to detain her. But the slave of her word, and firm in resolution, neither the tears of the one nor the prayers of the others could prevail upon her. All that they could extort from her was, that she would defer her departure as long as she could. The 2 months had nearly expired, and every morning she determined to bid adieu to her family, without having the heart when night arrived to say farewell. In the combat between her affection and her gratitude, she could not lean to the one without doing injustice to the other. In the midst of her embarrassment, it needed nothing less than a dream to decide her. She fancied she was at the palace of the Beast, and walking in a retired avenue, terminated by a thicket full of brambles, concealing the entrance to a cavern, out of which issued horrible groans. She recognized the voice of the Beast, and ran to his assistance. The monster, who, in her dream, appeared stretched upon the ground and dying, reproached her with being the cause of his death, and having repaid his affection with the blackest ingratitude. She then saw the lady who had before appeared to her in her sleep, and who said to her in a severe tone, that it would be her destruction if she hesitated any longer to fulfill her engagements. That she had given her word to the beast that she would return in 2 months. That the time had expired, that the delay of another day would be fatal to the beast. That the trouble she was creating in her father's house, and the hatred of her sisters, ought to increase her desire to return to the palace of the beast, where everything combined to delight her. Beauty, terrified by this dream, and fearing to be the cause of the death of the beast, awoke with a start, and went immediately to inform her family that she could no longer delay her departure. This intelligence produced various effects. Her father's tears spoke for him. Her brothers protested that they would not allow her to leave them. And her lovers, in despair, swore they would not suffer the house to be robbed of its brightest ornament. Her sisters alone, far from appearing distressed at her departure, were loud in praise of her sense of honor. And affecting to possess the same virtue themselves, had the audacity to assure her that if they had pledged their words to the beast as she had done, they should not have suffered his ugliness to have interfered with their feelings of duty, and that they should have long ere that time been on their road back to the marvelous palace. It was thus they endeavored to disguise the cruel jealousy that rankled in their hearts. Beauty, however, charmed by their apparent generosity, thought only of convincing her brothers and her lovers of the obligation she was under to leave them. But her brothers loved her too much to consent to her going, and her lovers were too infatuated to listen to reason. All of them being ignorant of the mode in which Beauty had arrived at her father's house, and never doubting but that the horse which first conveyed her to the palace of the beast would be sent to take her back again, resolved amongst themselves to prevent it. Her sisters, who only concealed the delight by the affectation of a sentiment of horror, as they perceived the hour approach for Beauty's departure, were frightened to death lest anything should occur to delay her, but Beauty, firm in her resolution, knowing whither duty called her, and having no more time to lose, if she would prolong the existence of the beast, her benefactor, at nightfall took leave of her family, and of all those who were interested in her destiny. She assured them that whatever steps they took to prevent her departure, she should, nevertheless, be in the palace of the beast the next morning before they were stirring. That all their schemes would be fruitless, and that she had determined to return to the enchanted palace. She did not forget, on going to bed, to turn her ring. She slept very soundly, and did not awake until the clock in her chamber, striking noon, chimed her name to music. By that sound she knew that her wishes were accomplished. As soon as she evinced a disposition to rise, her couch was surrounded by all the animals who had been so eager to serve her, and who unanimously testified the gratification at her return, and expressed the sorrow they had felt at her long absence. The day seemed to her longer than any she had previously passed in that palace, not so much from regret for those she had quitted as from her impatience again to behold the beast, and to say everything she could to him in the way of excuse for her conduct. She was also animated by another desire, that of again holding in slumber one of those sweet conversations with her dear unknown, a pleasure she had been deprived of during the 2 months she had passed with her family, in which she could not enjoy anywhere but in that palace. The beast and the unknown were, in short, alternately the subjects of her reflections. One moment she reproached herself for not returning the affection of a lover who, under the form of a monster, displayed so noble a mind. The next she deplored having set her heart upon a visionary object, who had no existence except in her dreams. She began to doubt whether she ought to prefer the imaginary devotion of a phantom to the real affection of the beast. The very dream in which the unknown appeared to her was invariably accompanied by warnings not to trust to sight. She feared it was but an idle illusion, born of the vapors of the brain, and destroyed by light of day. Thus undecided, loving the unknown, yet not wishing to displease the beast, and seeking repose from her thoughts in some entertainment, she went to the French comedy, 24, which she found exceedingly poor. Shutting the window abruptly, she hoped to be better pleased at the opera. She thought the music miserable. The Italians were equally unable to amuse her. Their comedy appeared to her to want smartness, wit and action. Weariness and distaste accompanied her everywhere, and prevented her taking pleasure in anything. The gardens had no attractions for her. Her court endeavored to entertain her, but the monkeys lost their labor in frisking, and the parrots and other birds in chattering and singing. She was impatient for the visit of the beast, the noise of whose approach she expected to hear every instant. But the hour so much desired came without the appearance of the monster. Alarmed, and almost angry at his delay, she tried in vain to account for his absence. Divided through hope and fear, her mind agitated, her heart a prey to melancholy, she descended into the gardens, determined not to re-enter the palace till she had found the beast. No trace of him could she discover anywhere. She called him. Echo alone answered her. Having passed more than 3 hours in this disagreeable exercise, overcome by fatigue, she sank upon a garden seat. She imagined the beast was either dead or had abandoned the place. She saw herself alone in that palace, without the hope of ever leaving it. She regretted her conversations with the beast, unentertaining as they had been to her, and what appeared to her extraordinary, even to discover she had so much feeling for him. She blamed herself for not having married him, and considering she had been the cause of his death, for she feared her too long absence had occasioned it, heaped upon herself the keenest and most bitter reproaches. In the midst of her miserable reflections she perceived that she was seated in that very avenue in which, during the last night she had passed under her father's roof, she had dreamed she saw the beast expiring in some strange cavern. Convinced that chance had not conducted her to this spot, she rose and hurried towards the thicket, which she found was not impenetrable. She discovered another hollow, which appeared to be that she had seen in her dream. As the moon gave but a feeble light, the monkey pages immediately appeared with a sufficient number of torches to illuminate the chasm, and to reveal to her the beast stretched upon the earth, as she thought, asleep. Far from being alarmed at his sight, Beauty was delighted, and, approaching him boldly, placed her hand upon his head, and called to him several times, but finding him cold and motionless, she no longer doubted he was dead, and consequently gave utterance to the most mournful shrieks and the most affecting exclamations. The assurance of his death, however, did not prevent her from making every effort to recall him to life. On placing her hand on his heart she felt, to her great joy, that it still beat. Without further delay, Beauty ran out of the cave to the basin of a fountain, where, taking up some water in her joined hands, she hastened back with it, and sprinkled it upon him. But as she could bring very little at a time, and spilt some of it before she could return to the beast, her assistance had been but meager if the monkey courtiers had not flown to the palace, and returned with such speed that in a moment she was furnished with a vase for water, as well as with proper restoratives. She caused him to smell them and swallow them, and they produced so excellent an effect that he soon began to move and show some kind of consciousness. She cheered him with her voice and caressed him as he recovered. "What anxiety have you caused me?" said she to him, kindly. "I knew not how much I loved you. The fear of losing you has proved to me that I was attached to you by stronger ties than those of gratitude. I vow to you that I had determined to die if I had failed in restoring you to life." At these tender words the beast, feeling perfectly revived, replied, in a voice which was still feeble, "It is very kind of you, Beauty, to love so ugly a monster, but you do well. I love you better than my life. I thought you would never return, it would have killed me. Since you love me I will live. Retire to rest, and assure yourself that you will be as happy as your good heart renders you worthy to be." Beauty had never before heard so long a speech from the beast. It was not very eloquent, but it pleased, from its gentleness and the sincerity observable in it. She had expected to be scolded, or at least to have been reproached. She had from this moment a better opinion of his disposition. No longer thinking him so stupid, she even considered his short answers a proof of his prudence, and, more and more prepossessed in his favor, she retired to her apartment, her mind occupied with the most flattering ideas. Extremely fatigued, she found there all the refreshments she needed. Her heavy eyelids promised her a sweet slumber. Asleep almost as soon as her head was on her pillow, her dear unknown failed not to present himself immediately. What tender words did he not utter to express the pleasure he experienced at seeing her again? He assured her that she would be happy, that it only remained to her to follow the impulse of her good heart. Beauty asked him if her happiness was to arise from her marriage with the beast. The unknown replied that it was the only means of securing it. She felt somewhat annoyed at this. She thought it even extraordinary that her lover should advise her to make her rival happy. After this first dream, she thought she saw the beast dead at her feet. An instant afterwards the unknown reappeared, and disappeared again as instantly, to give place to the beast. But what she observed most distinctly was the lady, who seemed to say to her, "I am pleased with thee. Continue to follow the dictates of reason, and trouble thyself about naught. I undertake the task of rendering thee happy." Beauty, although asleep, appeared to acknowledge her partiality to the unknown and her repugnance to the monster, whom she could not consider lovable. The lady smiled at her objections, and advised her not to make herself uneasy about her affection for the unknown, for that the emotions she felt were not incompatible with the resolution she had formed to do her duty, that she might follow her inclinations without resistance, and that her happiness would be perfected by espousing the beast. This dream, which only ended with her sleep, furnished her with an inexhaustible source of reflection. In this vision, as in those which had preceded it, she found more coherence than is usually displayed in dreams, and she therefore determined to consent to this strange union. But the image of the unknown rose unceasingly to trouble her. It was the sole obstacle, but not a slight one. Still uncertain as to the course she ought to take, she went to the opera, but without terminating her embarrassment. At the end of the performance she sat down to supper. The arrival of the beast was alone capable of deciding her. Far from reproaching her for her long absence, the monster, as if the pleasure of seeing her had made him forget his past distresses, appeared, on entering Beauty's apartment, to have no other anxiety but that of ascertaining if she had been much amused, if she had been well received, and if her health had been good. She answered these questions, and added politely that she had paid dearly for all the pleasures his care had enabled her to enjoy, by the cruel pain she had endured on finding him in so sad a state on her return. The beast briefly thanked her, and then being about to take his leave, asked her, as usual, if she would marry him. Beauty was silent for a short time, but at last making up her mind, she said to him, trembling, "Yes, beast, I am willing, if you will pledge me your faith, to give you mine." "I do," replied the beast, "and I promise you never to have any wife but you." "Then," rejoined Beauty, "I accept you for my husband, and swear to be a fond and faithful wife to you." She had scarcely uttered these words when a discharge of artillery was heard, and that she might not doubt it being a signal of rejoicing, she saw from her windows the sky all in a blaze with the light of 20,000 fireworks, which continued rising for 3 hours. They formed true lovers' knots, while on elegant escutcheons appeared Beauty's initials, and beneath them, in well-defined letters, "Long live Beauty and her husband." After this display had terminated, the beast took his departure, and Beauty retired to rest. No sooner was she asleep than her dear unknown paid her his usual visit. He was more richly attired than she had ever seen him. "How deeply am I obliged to you, charming Beauty," said he. "You have released me from the frightful prison in which I have groaned for so long a time. Your marriage with the beast will restore a king to his subjects, a son to his mother, and life to a whole kingdom. We shall all be happy." Beauty, at these words, felt bitterly annoyed, perceiving that the unknown, far from evincing the despair such an engagement as she had entered into should have caused him, gazed on her with eyes sparkling with extreme delight. She was about to express her discontent to him, when the lady, in her turn, appeared in her dream. "Behold thee victorious," said she. "We owe everything to thee, Beauty. Thou hast suffered gratitude to triumph over every other feeling. None but thou would have had the courage to keep their word at the expense of their inclination, nor to have periled their life to have saved that of their father. In return for this, there are none who can ever hope to enjoy such happiness as thy virtue has won for thee. Thou knowest at present little, but the rising sun shall tell thee more." When the lady had disappeared, Beauty again saw the unknown youth, but stretched on the earth as dead. All the night passed in such dreams, but they had become familiar to her, and did not prevent her from sleeping long and soundly. It was broad daylight when she awoke. The sun streamed into her apartment with more brilliancy than usual. Her monkeys had not closed the shutters. Believing the sight that met her eyes but a continuation of her dreams, and that she was sleeping still, her joy and surprise were extreme at discovering that it was a reality, and that on a couch beside her lay, in a profound slumber, her beloved unknown, looking 1,000 times more handsome than he had done in her vision. To assure herself of the fact, she arose hastily and took from off her toilet table the miniature she usually wore on her arm. But she could not have been mistaken. She spoke to him, in the hope of awaking him from the trance into which he seemed to have been thrown by some wonderful power. Not stirring at her voice, she shook him by the arm. This effort was equally ineffectual, and only served to convince her that he was under the influence of enchantment, and that she must await the end of the charm, which it was reasonable to suppose had an appointed period. How delighted was she to find herself betrothed to him who alone had caused her to hesitate, and to find that she had done from duty that which she would have done from inclination. She no longer doubted the promise of happiness which had been made to her in her dreams. She now knew that the lady had truly assured her that her love for the unknown was not incompatible with the affection she entertained for the beast, seeing that they were one and the same person. In the meanwhile, however, her husband never woke. After a slight meal she endeavored to pass away the time in her usual occupations, but they appeared to her insipid. As she could not resolve to leave her apartments, nor bear to sit idle, she took up some music, and began to sing. Her birds hearing her, joined their voices to hers, and made a concert, the more charming to her as she expected every moment it would be interrupted by the awakening of her husband, for she flattered herself she could dissolve the spell by the harmony of her voice. The spell was soon broken, but not by the means she imagined. She heard the sound of a chariot rolling beneath the windows of her apartment, and the voices of several persons approaching. At the same moment the monkey captain of the guard, by the beak of his parrot interpreter, announced the visit of some ladies. Beauty, from her windows, beheld the chariot that brought them. It was of an entirely novel description, and of matchless beauty. 4 white stags, with horns and hoofs of gold, superbly caparisoned, drew this equipage, the singularity of which increased Beauty's desire to know who were the owners of it. By the noise, which became louder, she was aware that the ladies had nearly reached the antechamber. She considered it right to advance and receive them. She recognized in one of them the lady she had been accustomed to behold in her dreams. The other was not less beautiful. Her high and distinguished bearing sufficiently indicated that she was an illustrious personage. She was no longer in the bloom of youth, but her air was so majestic that Beauty was uncertain to which of the 2 strangers she ought first to address herself. She was still under this embarrassment, when the one with whose features she was already familiar, and who appeared to exercise some sort of superiority over the other, turning to her companion, said, "Well, Queen, what think you of this beautiful girl? You owe to her the restoration of your son to life, for you must admit that the miserable circumstances under which he existed could not be called living. Without her, you would never again have beheld this prince. He must have remained in the horrible shape to which he had been transformed, had he not found in the world one only person who possessed virtue and courage equal to her beauty. I think you will behold with pleasure the son she has restored to you become her husband. They love each other, and nothing is wanting to their perfect happiness but your consent. Will you refuse to bestow it on them?" The Queen, at these words, embracing Beauty affectionately, exclaimed, "Far from refusing my consent, the union will afford me the greatest felicity. Charming and virtuous child, to whom I am under so many obligations, tell me who you are, and the names of the sovereigns who are so happy as to have given birth to so perfect a princess." "Madam," replied Beauty, modestly, "it is long since I had a mother. My father is a merchant more distinguished in the world for his probity and his misfortunes than for his birth." At this frank declaration, the astonished Queen recoiled a pace or 2, and said, "What? You are only a merchant's daughter? Ah, great fairy," she added, casting a mortified look on her companion, and then remained silent, but her manner sufficiently expressed her thoughts, and her disappointment was legible in her eyes. "It appears to me," said the fairy, haughtily, "that you are discontented with my choice. You regard with contempt the condition of this young person, and yet she was the only being in the world who was capable of executing my project, and who could make your son happy." "I am very grateful to her for what she has done," replied the Queen. "But, powerful spirit," she continued, "I cannot refrain from pointing out to you the incongruous mixture of that noblest blood in all the world which runs in my son's veins with that of the obscure race from which the person has sprung to whom you would unite him. I confess I am little gratified by the supposed happiness of the prince, if it must be purchased by an alliance so degrading to us, and so unworthy of him. Is it impossible to find in the world a maiden whose birth is equal to her virtue? I know many excellent princesses by name, why am I not permitted to hope that I may see him the possessor of one of those?" At this moment the handsome unknown appeared. The arrival of his mother and the fairy had aroused him, and the noise they had made was more effective than all the efforts of Beauty. Such being the nature of the spell, the Queen held him a long time in her arms, without speaking a word. She found again a son whose fine qualities rendered him worthy of all her affection. What joy for the prince to see himself released from a horrible form, and a stupidity more painful to him because it was affected and had not obscured his reason. He had recovered the liberty to appear in his natural form by means of the object of his love, and that reflection made it still more precious to him. After the first transports which nature inspired him with at the sight of his mother, the prince hastened to pay those thanks to the fairy which duty and gratitude prompted. He did so in the most respectful terms, but as briefly as possible, in order to be at liberty to turn his attentions towards Beauty. He had already, by tender glances, expressed to her his feelings, and was about to confirm with his lips, in the most touching language, what his eyes had spoken, when the fairy stopped him, and bade him be the judge between her and his mother. "Your mother," said she, "condemns the engagement you have entered into with Beauty. She considers that her birth is too much beneath yours. For my part, I think that her virtues make up for that inequality. It is for you, Prince, to say with which of us your own feelings coincide. And that you may be under no restraint in declaring to us your real sentiments, I announce to you that you have full liberty of choice. Although you have pledged your word to this amiable person, you are free to withdraw it. I will answer for her, that beauty will release you from your promise without the least hesitation, although, through her kindness, you have regained your natural form. And I assure you also that her generosity will cause her to carry disinterestedness to the extent of leaving you at liberty to dispose of your hand in favor of any person on whom the Queen may advise you to bestow it. What say you, beauty? Pursued the fairy, turning towards her. Have I been mistaken in thus interpreting your sentiments? Would you desire a husband who would become so with regret? Assuredly not, madam, replied Beauty. The prince is free. I renounce the honor of being his wife. When I accepted him, I believed I was taking pity on something below humanity. I engaged myself to him only with the object of conferring on him the most signal favor. Ambition had no place in my thoughts. Therefore, great fairy, I implore you to exact no sacrifice from the Queen, whom I cannot blame for the scruples she entertains under such circumstances. Well, Queen, what say you to that? Inquired the fairy, in a disdainful and displeased tone. Do you consider that princesses, who are so by the caprice of fortune, better deserve the high rank in which it has placed them than this young maiden? For my part, I think she should not be prejudiced by an origin from which she has elevated herself by her conduct. The Queen replied with some embarrassment, beauty is incomparable. Her merit is infinite, nothing can surpass it, but, madam, can we not find some other mode of rewarding her? Is it not to be effected without sacrificing to her the hand of my son? Then turning to Beauty, she continued, yes, I owe you more than I can pay. I put, therefore, no limit to your desires. Ask boldly, I will grant you everything, with that sole exception, but the difference will not be great to you. Choose a husband from amongst the nobles of my court. However high in rank, he will have cause to bless his good fortune, and for your sake I will place him so near the throne that your position will be scarcely less enviable. I thank you, madam, replied Beauty, but I ask no reward from you. I am more than repaid by the pleasure of having broken the spell which had deprived a great prince of his mother and of his kingdom. My happiness would have been perfect if I had rendered this service to my own sovereign. All I desire is that the fairy will deign to restore me to my father. The prince, who, by order of the fairy, had been silent throughout this conversation, was no longer master of himself, and his respect for the commands he had received, failed to restrain him. He flung himself at the feet of the fairy and of his mother, and implored them, in the strongest terms, not to make him more miserable than he had been, by sending away Beauty, and depriving him of the happiness of being her husband. At these words, Beauty, gazing on him with an air full of tenderness, but mingled with a noble pride, said, Prince, I cannot conceal from you my affection. Your disenchantment is a proof of it, and I should in vain endeavor to disguise my feelings. I confess without a blush, that I love you better than myself. Why should I dissimulate? We may disavow evil impulses. But mine are perfectly innocent, and are authorized by the generous fairy to whom we are both so much indebted. But if I could resolve to sacrifice my feelings when I thought it my duty to do so for the beast, you must feel assured that I shall not falter on this occasion when it is no longer the interest of the monster that is at stake, but your own. It is enough for me to know who you are, and that I am to renounce the glory of being your wife. I will even venture to say, that if, yielding to your entreaties, the Queen should grant the consent you ask, it would not alter the case, for in my own reason, and even in my love, you would meet with an insurmountable obstacle. I repeat that I ask no favor but that of being allowed to return to the bosom of my family, where I shall forever cherish the remembrance of your bounty and your affection. Generous fairy, exclaimed the prince, clasping her hands in supplication, for mercy's sake, do not allow Beauty to depart. Make me, rather, again the monster that I was, for then I shall be her husband. She pledged her word to the beast, and I prefer that happiness to all those she has restored me to, if I must purchase them so dearly. The fairy made no answer, she but looked steadily at the Queen, who was moved by so much true affection, but whose pride remained unshaken. The despair of her son affected her, yet she could not forget that Beauty was the daughter of a merchant, and nothing more. She, notwithstanding, feared the anger of the fairy, whose manner and silence sufficiently evinced her indignation. Her confusion was extreme. Not having power to utter a word, she feared to see a fatal termination to a conference which had offended the protecting spirit. No one spoke for some minutes, but the fairy at length broke the silence, and casting an affectionate look upon the lovers, she said to them, I find you worthy of each other. It would be a crime to part two such excellent persons. You shall not be separated, I promise you, and I have sufficient power to fulfill my promise. The queen shuddered at these words, and would have made some remonstrance, but the fairy anticipated her by saying, For you, queen, the little value you set upon virtue, unadorned by the vain titles which alone you respect, would justify me in heaping on you the bitterest reproaches. But I excuse your fault, arising from pride of birth, and I will take no other vengeance beyond doing this little violence to your prejudices, and for which you will not be long without thanking me. Beauty, at these words, embraced the knees of the fairy, and exclaimed, Ah, do not expose me to the misery of being told all my life that I am unworthy of the rank to which your bounty would elevate me. Reflect that this prince, who now believes that his happiness consists in the possession of my hand, may very shortly perhaps be of the same opinion as the queen. No, no, Beauty, fear nothing, rejoined the fairy. The evils you anticipate cannot come to pass. I know a sure way of protecting you from them, and should the prince be capable of despising you after marriage, he must seek some other reason than the inequality of your condition. Your birth is not inferior to his own. Nay, the advantage is even considerably on your side, for the truth is, said she, sternly, to the queen, that you behold your niece. And what must render her still more worthy of your respect is, that she is mine also, being the daughter of my sister, who was not, like you, a slave to rank which is lustreless without virtue. That fairy, knowing how to estimate true worth, did your brother, the king of the happy island, the honor to marry him. I preserved this fair fruit of their union from the fury of a fairy who desired to be her stepmother. From the moment of her birth I destined her to be the wife of your son. I desired, by concealing from you the result of my good service, to give you an opportunity of showing your confidence in me. I had some reason to believe that it was greater than it appears to have been. You might have relied upon me for watching over the destiny of the prince. I had given you proofs enough of the interest I took in it, and you needed not to have been under any apprehension that I should expose him to anything that would be disgraceful to himself or to you. I feel persuaded, madam, continued she, with a smile which had still something of bitterness in it, that you will not object to honor us with your alliance. The queen, astonished and embarrassed, knew not what to answer. The only way to atone for her fault was to confess it frankly, and evince a sincere repentance. I am guilty, generous fairy, said she. Your bounties should have satisfied me that you would not suffer my son to have formed an alliance unworthy of him. But pardon, I beseech you, the prejudices of my rank, which urged that royal blood could not marry one of humbler birth without degradation. I acknowledge that I deserve you should punish me by giving to Beauty a mother-in-law more worthy of her. But you take too kind an interest in my son to render him the victim of my error. As to you, dear Beauty, she continued, embracing her tenderly, you must not resent my resistance. It was caused by my desire to marry my son to my niece, whom the fairy had often assured me was living, notwithstanding all appearances to the contrary. She had drawn so charming a portrait of her, that without knowing you, I loved you dearly enough to risk offending the fairy, in order to preserve to you the throne and the heart of my son. So saying, she recommenced her caresses, which Beauty received with respect. The prince, on his part, enraptured at this agreeable intelligence, expressed his delight in looks alone. Behold us all satisfied, said the fairy, and now, to terminate this happy adventure, we only need the consent of the royal father of the princess. But we shall shortly see him here. Beauty requested her to permit the person who had brought her up, and whom she had hitherto looked upon as her father, to witness her felicity. I admire such consideration, said the fairy, it is worthy a noble mind, and as you desire it, I undertake to inform him. Then taking the queen by the hand, she led her away, under the pretext of showing her over the enchanted palace. It was to give the newly betrothed pair the liberty of conversing with each other for the first time without restraint or the aid of illusion. They would have followed, but she forbade them. The happiness in store for them inspired each with equal delight. They could not entertain the least doubt of their mutual affection. Their conversation, confused and unconnected, their protestations 100 times repeated, were to them more convincing proofs of love than the most eloquent language could have afforded. After having exhausted all the expressions that passion suggests under such circumstances to those that are truly in love, Beauty inquired of her lover by what misfortune he had been so cruelly transformed into a beast. She requested him also to relate to her all the events of his life preceding that shocking metamorphosis. The prince, whose recovery of his natural form had not lessened his anxiety to obey her, without more ado commenced his narrative in the following words.